The massive doors of the Galactic Council chamber slid open with a deep rumble that echoed through the vast space. Captain Jake Morrison stepped inside, his black uniform crisp and clean against the alien architecture that surrounded him. Behind him walked Commander Lisa Parker, her blonde hair pulled back in a tight bun, her blue eyes scanning the enormous room with careful attention. The chamber was bigger than any stadium Morrison had ever seen on Earth. Hundreds of seats rose around a central platform, each one designed for a different alien species. Some seats were filled with water for the aquatic delegates. Others glowed with heat lamps for the cold-blooded representatives. The air itself seemed to shimmer with different atmospheric mixtures pumped in for beings who breathed gases that would kill humans in seconds. Morrison had trained for this moment for 3 years. He had studied every known alien species, learned their customs, practiced their greetings. But nothing had prepared him for the sheer size and strangeness of this place. The ceiling disappeared into darkness above them, and strange lights pulsed, in patterns that hurt his eyes to look at directly. "Remember," Parker whispered beside him, "we only get one chance at this." Morrison nodded. Earth had been trying to join the Galactic Council for 50 years. Every application had been rejected. Every request for membership had been denied. This was humanity's last opportunity to prove they belonged among the stars. The human delegation took their seats in the center of the chamber. Morrison looked around at the alien faces staring down at them. Some had multiple eyes that blinked in sequence. Others had no eyes at all, just sensing organs that twitched and moved as they examined the humans. A few species looked almost human, but their skin was the wrong color or their limbs bent in impossible ways. The largest seat in the chamber belonged to Ambassador Zefkar of the Vorthak Empire. The reptilian being was nearly 10 feet tall, covered in dark green scales that reflected the chamber's lights. His head was long and narrow, filled with sharp teeth that showed when he spoke. His eyes were yellow with black slits like a snake's eyes, and they never seemed to blink. Zefkar had been opposing human membership for decades. His species controlled 12 star systems and commanded a fleet of warships that could destroy entire planets. He had fought in battles across the galaxy, conquered worlds, and ruled over billions of beings. To him, humans were nothing more than primitive animals who had barely learned to leave their own planet. "The humans request membership," once again, announced the council speaker, a being made of living crystal whose voice rang like bells. "Ambassador Zefkar, you have the floor." Zefkar rose from his seat, his massive form casting shadows across the chamber floor. When he spoke, his voice was deep and harsh like rocks grinding together. "Honored council members," he began, his yellow eyes fixed on Morrison. "We gather today to discuss the humans' latest request to join our alliance. I have reviewed their application, studied their history, and examined their achievements. My conclusion is simple: they are not worthy." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the chamber. Several alien delegates nodded or made their species equivalent, gestures of approval. Morrison felt his stomach tighten, but he kept his face calm. "These soft creatures speak of strength," Zefkar continued, his voice growing louder. "Yet they barely survive their own planetary conflicts. They request alliance with species who have conquered entire star systems, while they struggled to control a single world." The Vorthak ambassador gestured toward the humans with one clawed hand. "Look at them. They have no natural weapons, no armor, no protective shells or poisonous secretions. They are weak, fragile beings who require artificial environments to survive in space. Their lifespans are pitifully short. Their technology is primitive compared to ours." More agreements came from the assembled aliens. Morrison saw Parker's jaw tighten beside him, but she remained silent. They had agreed that Morrison would do all the talking unless absolutely necessary. "But surely," Zefkar said, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "they have some great achievement to show us? Some mighty conquest to prove their worth?" He paused, checking a datapad with exaggerated care. "Ah yes, their greatest accomplishment was supposedly surviving something they call World War II, a planetary conflict that lasted merely 6 years. Laughter filled the chamber. Not human laughter, but the alien equivalent. Clicking sounds, whistles, gurgling noises, and electronic beeps. The sound was strange and unsettling, but the meaning was clear. They were laughing at humanity. 6 years. Zefkar repeated, his crest of spines rising with amusement. My people have waged campaigns spanning centuries across multiple worlds. The Zerian Collective has fought wars that lasted longer than your entire recorded history. The plasma wraiths have conquered systems in less time than your world war lasted. Morrison felt heat rising in his cheeks, but he forced himself to remain still. This was exactly what they had expected. Zefkar always attacked human military. History first. I have personally led battles that involved more soldiers than existed on your entire planet during this conflict. Zefkar continued. My flagship alone carries more firepower than your entire species possessed during their Great War. Yet they present this as evidence of their strength? The laughter grew louder. Even some of the more neutral species seemed amused by Zefkar's words. Morrison could see delegates turning to each other, sharing what were probably jokes about human weakness. Perhaps, said a voice from the aquatic section, they could tell us about their space battles, their conquest of other worlds? There are none, Zefkar replied with obvious pleasure. They have visited their own moon, sent a few probes to nearby planets, but conquered nothing. They have no colonies, no subject species, no tribute worlds. They are a single-planet species asking to join an alliance of galactic empires. The chamber erupted in more laughter. Morrison saw Parker's hands clench into fists on her lap, but she kept her expression neutral. I propose, Zefkar announced, raising his voice above the noise, that we deny their request immediately. These humans are too weak, too fragile, too inexperienced to stand beside true warriors of the galaxy. They would be a burden rather than an asset. Their planet would be better served as a protectorate under Vorthak guidance. The suggestion of making Earth a protectorate brought cheers from several delegates. Morrison knew what that meant. Earth would become a vassal world, required to provide resources and labor to the Vorthak Empire. Humans would become slaves in all but name. All in favor of immediate rejection? Zefkar called out. Hands, claws, tentacles, and other appendages began to rise throughout the chamber. Morrison counted them quickly. More than half the council was ready to vote against humanity without even hearing their presentation. It was time to act. Captain Morrison stood up slowly from his seat. The movement was deliberate and calm, but it cut through the noise in the chamber like a blade. The laughter began to die down as alien eyes turned toward him. His uniform was simple compared to the elaborate armor and decorations worn by the other delegates, but something in his posture commanded attention. Ambassador Zefkar, Morrison said, his voice clear and steady. The acoustics of the chamber carried his words to every corner. You speak of conquest and campaigns, but I wonder if you truly understand what strength means. Zefkar's yellow eyes narrowed. His amusement was fading, replaced by irritation. Spare us your primitive philosophy, human. Strength is measured in victories, in worlds conquered, in enemies defeated. Your species has achieved none of these things on any meaningful scale. You dismiss our history without understanding it, Morrison replied, taking a step forward. You talk about campaigns that lasted centuries, but tell me something, Ambassador. Have you ever faced true desperation? Have your people ever been pushed to the absolute edge of extinction and still refused to surrender? A few delegates shifted in their seats. The question was unexpected, and it carried weight that even the most arrogant species could recognize. Zefkar's crest flared with annoyance. The Vorthak Empire has never been in such a position because we are strong. We do not allow ourselves to be pushed to desperation through weakness and poor planning. Then you have never truly been tested, Morrison said simply. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Several delegates leaned forward, sensing that something significant was happening. The Zellarian representative, whose crystal body refracted light into rainbow patterns, chimed with interest. Are you suggesting, Zefkar said, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl, that my people are untested? That the Vorthak Empire lacks courage? I am suggesting, Morrison replied, that there is a difference between conquering the weak and surviving when you are the weak. Your empire has always fought from positions of strength, with superior numbers and better weapons. But what happens when those advantages are stripped away? What happens when survival depends not on technology or numbers but on the refusal to give up? Parker activated a small device on her wrist. A holographic display materialized above the human delegation, showing a blue-green planet rotating, slowly in space. Earth looked peaceful and beautiful from this distance, its white clouds swirling over green continents and blue oceans. "This is our world," Morrison continued. "It may look small to you, insignificant, but on this world we learned something that your empire with all its conquests has never had to learn. We learned what it means to fight when defeat seems certain." The plasma wraith delegate, a being of contained energy that flickered and danced, in its containment suit, sparked with curiosity. "You speak of a single battle as if it defines your entire species." "Not a single battle," Morrison corrected. "Thousands of battles, millions of individual moments where humans chose to stand and fight rather than surrender. But since Ambassador Zefkar finds our conflict so amusing, let me tell you about one city. One battle that lasted 200 days and changed everything." The holographic display zoomed in on Earth, focusing on a continent, then a country, then a river. The image showed a large city spread along the banks of a wide waterway. "This city was called Stalingrad," Morrison said. "In your language, the name would translate to City of Steel. It was an industrial center, important for manufacturing, but not particularly large by galactic standards. About 1 million people lived there when the battle began." Zefkar snorted. 1 million? My smallest conquest involved a world with 50 billion inhabitants. "Numbers," Morrison said, shaking his head. "You always return to numbers. This is not about how many people live there, Ambassador. This is about what those people did when faced with annihilation." The display changed, showing military formations moving across a map. Red arrows advanced toward blue defensive positions, overwhelming them with ease. In the summer of 1942, an army of over 300,000 soldiers advanced on Stalingrad. They had tanks, aircraft, and artillery that could level city blocks. They had supplies, reinforcements, and every advantage that superior technology and numbers could provide. Morrison paused, looking directly at Zefkar. They expected to take the city in days, maybe weeks at most. After all, they had already conquered most of a continent. They had defeated armies much larger than the small garrison defending Stalingrad. "As any competent military force would," Zefkar replied, but his voice lacked its earlier mockery. "The defenders numbered fewer than 50,000 regular soldiers," Morrison continued. "They were supported by civilians who had never held weapons before. Workers from the factories, teachers, clerks, people who should have evacuated when they saw the enemy coming." The Methane Collective delegate, speaking through a translation device, asked, "Why did they not retreat? Surely preservation of life is more important than holding territory?" Morrison smiled grimly. "That is exactly what any logical species would do. Any reasonable military commander would have withdrawn across the river, regrouped, and waited for reinforcements. The attacking force was 6 times larger, better equipped, and had air superiority." "Then why did they not?" asked the Zolarian, its crystalline voice ringing with confusion. "Because," Morrison said, "sometimes logic is not enough. Sometimes numbers are not enough. Sometimes superior technology is not enough. Sometimes what matters is the decision to stand and fight, regardless of the odds." The chamber was quieter now. Even the background hum of the life support system seemed muted. Morrison had their attention in a way that no human had ever achieved before. The Soviet commander, a man named Vasily Trikov, made a decision that would define the entire battle, Morrison continued. He moved his headquarters across the river, directly into the city that was under attack. He placed himself and his staff in the middle of the battlefield, where they could be killed at any moment. "Foolish," Zefkar muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. His message to his troops was simple, Morrison said, ignoring the interruption. "We will defend Stalingrad or die trying. There is no land beyond the Volga. Parker highlighted the HFY River on the display, showing how it curved around the city. The defensive positions were clearly visible, pressed against the water with nowhere to retreat. He cut off his own escape route? Asked a delegate from the Silicon Consortium, its mechanical voice processing the implications. Deliberately, Morrison confirmed. They had boats, bridges, ways to cross the river and retreat to safety. Instead, Chwikov ordered his men to prepare for a fight to the death. No retreat, no surrender, no matter what happened. The chamber fell completely silent. The concept of deliberately removing the possibility of retreat was alien to most of the species present. Military doctrine across the galaxy emphasized flexibility, the ability to withdraw and regroup when faced with superior force. They chose death over surrender? The Zalarian asked, its light pulsing with disbelief. They chose to fight, Morrison replied firmly. What happened next would test the very limits of what it means to be human. It would show the galaxy what our species is truly capable of when everything else is stripped away. Zefkar leaned forward in his seat, his earlier mockery completely gone. Despite himself, he was intrigued. What happened to them? Morrison looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes of delegates from dozens of species. They turned that city into a hell that would break the strongest army in human history. They proved that sometimes the weak can defeat the strong through sheer force of will. The silence stretched on. Finally, Zefkar spoke, his voice quieter than before. Tell us this story, human. Tell us what happened in your city of steel. Morrison's voice took on the rhythm of a storyteller as he began to paint the picture of what happened in Stalingrad. The holographic display shifted and changed, showing the city as it was before the battle began. Factories lined the river, smokestacks reached toward the sky, and people walked the streets going about their daily lives. The attack began on August 23, 1942, Morrison said. The German Luftwaffe sent over 600 aircraft to bomb the city. In a single day, they dropped more explosives on Stalingrad than had ever been dropped on one target in human history up to that point. The display showed wave after wave of aircraft flying over the city. Explosions bloomed like deadly flowers across the urban landscape. Buildings collapsed, fires spread, and smoke filled the air until the city almost disappeared beneath a black cloud. The bombing lasted 14 hours without stopping, Morrison continued. When it was over, most of the city was destroyed. Entire neighborhoods had been turned to rubble. The factories were damaged or destroyed. Thousands of civilians were dead. Several alien delegates shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Even species accustomed to warfare found the scale of destruction impressive for such primitive technology. Any reasonable defender would have surrendered at this point, Zefkar said, but his voice lacked its earlier mockery. The city was already lost. That is what the Germans thought too, Morrison replied. Their commander, General Paulus, sent a message to his superiors saying the city would fall within days. The bombing had been so effective that resistance should be minimal. Parker manipulated the display to show the German ground forces advancing toward the ruined city. Tanks rolled forward in neat formations, followed by trucks full of soldiers. Everything looked organized and professional. The German 6th Army was one of the finest military units in human history, Morrison explained. They had conquered Poland in weeks, defeated France in months, and pushed deep into Soviet territory. They had never been defeated in battle. Their soldiers were experienced, well-equipped, and confident. As they should have been, commented the Silicon Consortium delegate. Superior force applied with precision should yield predictable results. That is what every military manual in the galaxy says. Morrison agreed. But the Soviets had not read those manuals. When the German tanks reached the outskirts of Stalingrad, they found something unexpected. The display zoomed in on the ruined streets of the city. Among the rubble and collapsed buildings, small groups of figures could be seen moving, taking positions, preparing defenses. Resistance, Morrison said simply. Not organized military resistance with proper formations and supply lines, desperate resistance from people who had nowhere else to go. Impossible, muttered the Methane Collective delegate. Civilian populations flee from advancing armies. They do not engage in combat. Human civilians do, Morrison corrected. Factory. Workers picked up rifles for the first time in their lives. Teenagers who should have been in school became soldiers. Women and old men dug trenches and built barricades from the wreckage of their own homes. The plasma wraith flickered with interest. They had no training? No military organization? Some had training, Morrison admitted. The regular army soldiers, the police, some factory guards. But most were ordinary people who made an extraordinary choice. They decided to fight rather than run. Morrison paused, letting that sink in. Around the chamber, delegates were beginning to understand that this was not a typical military engagement. The first German units entered the city expecting light resistance. Morrison continued. What they found was something no military academy had prepared them for. Every building was a fortress. Every street was a trap. Every pile of rubble hid defenders who knew the terrain better than any map could show. The display showed German soldiers advancing cautiously through narrow streets, lined with destroyed buildings. From windows, from basements, from hidden positions in the rubble, muzzle flashes appeared. The neat military formations began to break apart as soldiers sought cover. The fighting was unlike anything either side had experienced, Morrison said. German tanks designed for open battlefield combat found themselves trapped in narrow streets where they could not maneuver. Infantry units that had swept across continents found themselves fighting for single rooms in destroyed buildings. Zefkar leaned forward, his reptilian features showing genuine interest. How long did this phase of the battle last? Months, Morrison replied. The Germans would capture a building in the morning, only to find that Soviet defenders had tunneled underneath during the night and retaken it. A single factory might change hands 15 times in one day. The display showed a three-dimensional view of the city, with red and blue areas constantly shifting as control of buildings and streets changed hands. It looked like a living organism, pulsing with conflict. The grain elevator, Morrison said, highlighting a tall building near the river. 50 Soviet soldiers held this position for over a month against thousands of German attackers. When the Germans finally captured it, they found the bodies of the last 13 defenders still at their posts, their weapons empty but their position never abandoned. Silence filled the chamber. The image of 13 soldiers fighting to the death rather than surrender resonated with even the most warlike species present. But surely, said the Zalarian delegate, the attackers had overwhelming advantages in weapons and supplies? They did, Morrison confirmed. German artillery could level any building the defenders tried to hold. Their aircraft could bomb any position that became too troublesome. They had more ammunition, better food, superior medical care, and regular reinforcements. Then how did the defenders continue to resist? Asked a delegate from the Aquatic Confederation, bubbles rising through the water in its speaking chamber. Morrison smiled grimly. They adapted. When buildings were destroyed by artillery, they fought from the basements. When the basements were bombed, they dug tunnels. When their ammunition ran low, they captured German weapons. When their food ran out, they ate whatever they could find. The display showed the underground network that developed beneath the city. Tunnels connected buildings, allowing defenders to move unseen. Supply routes ran through sewers and subway systems. Command posts operated from deep basements that could survive direct artillery hits. The Soviet 13th Guards Division was down to just 320 men when they were ordered to hold the central railway station, Morrison continued. They held it for over a week against an entire German regiment. When reinforcements finally reached them, they found 19 survivors still fighting. 19 out of 320? The Silicon Consortium delegate's mechanical voice carried disbelief. 19 who refused to surrender. Morrison corrected. At any point they could have thrown down their weapons and walked away. The Germans would have accepted their surrender. Instead, they chose to keep fighting until only 19 remained alive. Parker added new elements to the display, showing individual soldiers moving through the rubble, taking impossible shots, holding impossible positions. Each figure represented a real person who had made the choice to fight rather than flee. One Soviet sniper, Vasily Zaitsev, killed over 200 German soldiers during the battle, Morrison said. He turned the ruins into hunting grounds, each shot a psychological weapon against the invaders. Other snipers followed his example. The Germans began to fear moving in daylight, afraid that death waited behind every pile of rubble. How many such defenders were there? Zefkar asked, his voice quiet. Thousands, Morrison replied, each one making the same choice day after day, to fight rather than flee, to resist rather than surrender, to stand rather than kneel. The chamber was completely quiet now. The aliens were beginning to understand that they were hearing about something beyond normal military conflict. This was something else entirely. And the Germans? Asked the plasma wraith. How did they respond to such resistance? Morrison's expression grew darker. They learned what it means to fight humans who have nothing left to lose. Morrison's voice grew heavier as he continued the story. The holographic display showed the city of Stalingrad in the depths of winter, a frozen wasteland of broken buildings and ice-covered rubble. Snow fell constantly, covering the battlefield, in white that was quickly stained with blood and soot. October came, then November, Morrison said. The battle had been raging for over 2 months and still the city had not fallen. The Germans were frustrated, angry, and beginning to understand that this would not be the quick victory they had expected. The display showed German soldiers huddled around small fires, their summer uniforms inadequate for the brutal cold. Many had wrapped themselves in blankets taken from destroyed homes, but still they shivered constantly. The German High Command sent new orders, Morrison continued. Take the city at any cost. Use any methods necessary. Show no mercy to the defenders. Zefkar shifted in his seat. His species understood warfare, but the intensity of this human conflict was beginning to impress even him. What methods did they employ? Everything they had, Morrison replied. They brought in flamethrower units to burn defenders out of buildings. They used poison gas in the underground tunnels. They executed any civilians they suspected of helping the Soviet forces. The chamber grew quiet. Several delegates exchanged glances. Even in galactic warfare, there were usually rules, agreements about what was acceptable in combat. The Soviets responded in kind, Morrison said grimly. They booby-trapped buildings before retreating. They poisoned wells and food supplies. They turned every room into a death trap for anyone who entered. Parker changed the display to show a cross-section of a typical building in the battle zone. Every floor was a separate fortress, connected by stairs that had been turned into killing zones. Holes had been blown through walls to create new routes of movement. The basement was filled with defenders ready to emerge behind any attackers who made it inside. A German officer wrote in his diary, Morrison said, that they were not fighting human beings anymore, but devils who appeared from the ground, killed and disappeared again. He said his men were afraid to sleep because the enemy might tunnel up through the floor during the night. Psychological warfare, observed the Silicon Consortium delegate, effective against species that experience fear. But the Soviets were experiencing the same fear, Morrison pointed out. They knew that every day might be their last. They knew that German artillery could kill them at any moment. They knew that their ammunition was running low and their food was almost gone. The display showed Soviet defenders sharing a single piece of bread among 5 soldiers. Their uniforms were torn and dirty, their faces gaunt from hunger, but their eyes still held determination. So why did they continue fighting? Asked the Aquatic Confederation delegate. Because they had made a choice, Morrison replied simply. They had decided that some things were worth dying for. Their city, their families, their freedom. They would rather die fighting than live as slaves. The plasma wraith flickered with interest. But surely survival instincts would override such abstract concepts. Morrison shook his head. Not for humans. When we believe in something strongly enough, we can override every instinct we have. We can choose to die, rather than compromise what we believe is right. The winter scenes in the display grew more harsh. Temperatures dropped below -30 degrees Celsius. Soldiers on both sides froze to death at their posts. Water froze in canteens. Weapons jammed in the cold. The German soldiers were not prepared for winter warfare, Morrison explained. Their supply lines were stretched thin and warm clothing was slow to arrive. Thousands of them suffered frostbite. Many lost fingers and toes to the cold. What about the defenders? Zefkar asked. They suffered too, Morrison admitted. But they had advantages the Germans did not. They knew the city, knew where to find shelter. They shared body heat in the underground tunnels. They burned furniture and books for warmth. Most importantly, they were fighting for their home. The display showed Soviet soldiers wrapped in whatever they could find, huddled together in basement shelters. Despite their obvious suffering, they continued to maintain their weapons and prepare for the next attack. November became December, Morrison continued. The fighting grew more desperate on both sides. German units that had started with hundreds of men were down to dozens. Soviet regiments existed only on paper, their soldiers scattered among the ruins. Parker highlighted a particular area of the city on the display. The tractor factory became the center of some of the worst fighting. The building changed hands so many times that neither side could keep accurate count. Soviet workers continued to repair tanks in the basement while German soldiers fought for control of the upper floors. They continued manufacturing during combat. The Methane Collective Delegates translator struggled with the concept. Production never stopped completely, Morrison confirmed. Workers would assemble weapons during lulls in the fighting, then pick up those same weapons to defend their factory when the Germans attacked. The chamber was completely silent now. The idea of civilians continuing their jobs while fighting for their lives was beyond the experience of most galactic species. By December, both armies were exhausted, Morrison said. The Germans had lost over 200,000 men. The Soviets had lost even more. The city was completely destroyed. There were no intact buildings left, no functioning infrastructure, no normal life of any kind. The display showed the devastation clearly. Mountains of rubble, where neighborhoods had once stood. Frozen corpses buried in snow, smoke rising from fires that had burned for months. Any logical analysis would have concluded that the battle was pointless, Morrison continued. The city had no strategic value anymore. It was just ruins and death. Both sides should have withdrawn and fought somewhere else. But they did not, Zefkar said. It was not a question. They did not, Morrison confirmed, because by then, Stalingrad had become more than a city. It had become a symbol. For the Germans, it represented their ability to conquer any target they chose. For the Soviets, it represented their refusal to be conquered. The Zalarian delegates, crystalline form pulsed with complex patterns of light, a battle of wills rather than military objectives. Exactly, Morrison said. And in a battle of wills, humans have advantages that superior technology cannot overcome. Parker added new elements to the display, showing the psychological state of both armies. German morale indicators showed steady decline as the battle dragged on. Soviet indicators showed something different, fluctuating, but never completely breaking. The German soldiers wrote letters home, describing their fear and exhaustion, Morrison said. They begged for the battle to end for permission to retreat. Some units simply refused to attack anymore. And the Soviets? Asked the plasma wraith. They wrote letters too, Morrison replied. But their letters were different. They wrote about duty, about honor, about protecting their homeland. Even when they knew they were going to die, they wrote about why it was worth it. Morrison paused, looking around the chamber at the alien faces staring down at him. That is the difference, honored delegates. When humans fight for something we truly believe in, death becomes acceptable. Defeat becomes impossible. We simply refuse to stop. The silence stretched on for long moments. Finally, Zefkar spoke, his voice quiet and thoughtful. What happened next, Captain Morrison? How did this battle end? Morrison's voice filled the silent chamber as he prepared to reveal the climax of the Stalingrad story. The holographic display showed the frozen battlefield in January 1943, after nearly 5 months of continuous fighting. Both armies were shadows of their former selves, but the battle was far from over. January 10, 1943, Morrison began. Day 199 of the battle. The German 6th Army was trapped inside the city they had tried to conquer. Their supply lines had been cut. Their reinforcements had been defeated. They were surrounded, starving, and freezing to death. The display showed the tactical situation clearly. Red German positions were completely encircled by blue Soviet forces. Supply routes were marked with red X's, indicating they had been severed. The trapped army was like an island in an ocean of enemies. "Wait," Zefkar interrupted, his yellow eyes wide with surprise. "The attackers became the trapped? How is this possible?" While the German Sixth Army was focused on conquering Stalingrad, Morrison explained, the Soviet High Command was planning something much larger. They called it Operation Uranus. While their soldiers died in the rubble, holding every building and every street, other Soviet forces were gathering in secret. Parker manipulated the display to show the broader strategic picture. Massive Soviet armies had assembled north and south of the city, hidden from German reconnaissance. The forces were enormous, hundreds of thousands of soldiers with tanks, artillery, and aircraft. November 19th, Morrison continued. While the battle for the city raged on, these hidden armies attacked. Not the city itself, but the weaker Romanian and Italian forces protecting the German flanks. In 4 days, they cut through the enemy, lines like a blade through paper. The display showed the Soviet pincers closing around the German army. The movement was swift and decisive, trapping over 250,000 enemy soldiers inside a pocket of territory with no escape route. The hunters became the hunted, Morrison said with grim satisfaction. The army that had conquered half of Europe was now trapped and surrounded, with winter closing in and no way to resupply. The Methane Collective delegate's translator buzzed with confusion. But surely the German command would order a retreat before the trap closed. They tried, Morrison replied, but it was too late. The Soviets had planned carefully, waited patiently, and struck at the perfect moment. The German Sixth Army was cut off completely. The chamber buzzed with quiet conversations as delegates processed this information. The idea that defenders could turn the tables so completely on their attackers was difficult for many species to comprehend. The German commander, General Paulus, requested permission to break out. Morrison continued. His soldiers were starving, freezing, and dying of disease. But his orders came from the highest levels of German leadership. Hold your position at all costs. They ordered their own army to die rather than retreat? The Silicon Consortium delegate's mechanical voice carried disbelief. Pride, Morrison said simply. The German leadership could not admit that their finest army had been defeated by defenders they had dismissed as weak and primitive, so they ordered the Sixth Army to fight to the death. The display showed the deteriorating conditions inside the pocket. German soldiers were eating horses, then dogs, then leather boots boiled in water. Many were too weak to fight. Others had gone insane from hunger and cold. For weeks, the trapped army slowly died, Morrison said. The Soviets offered surrender terms, but the German command refused. They would rather see their soldiers starve than admit defeat. Zefkar leaned forward, his scales reflecting the light from the display. What happened to the defenders of the city during this time? They kept fighting, Morrison replied. Even though they knew the German army was trapped, even though victory was certain, they continued to battle for every building and every street. They took no chances, showed no mercy, gave no quarter. The plasma wraith flickered with admiration. They maintained discipline even in victory. They maintained hatred, Morrison corrected. The Germans had destroyed their city, killed their families, and tried to enslave their people. The Soviets wanted more than military victory. They wanted complete destruction of the enemy that had caused such suffering. Parker highlighted specific areas of the city on the display. Even in January, fighting continued in pockets throughout Stalingrad. Neither side was willing to stop until the battle was completely finished. January 31st, 1943, Morrison announced. Field Marshal Paulus, the German commander, was given a final choice by the Soviet forces. Surrender unconditionally, or face complete annihilation. The chamber was completely silent. Every delegate was focused on Morrison's words, waiting to hear how the impossible battle had finally ended. Paulus chose surrender, Morrison said quietly. The man who had led the conquest of half a continent, who had commanded the finest army in German history, who had been promoted to field marshal just hours before, surrendered to the defenders he had once dismissed as weak. The display showed German soldiers laying down their weapons, raising their hands, walking slowly toward Soviet lines. They were gaunt, ragged, and broken. Many could barely walk. All looked defeated in spirit as well as body. Of the original 300,000 German soldiers who had attacked Stalingrad, Morrison continued, fewer than 100,000 survived to become prisoners. Of those prisoners, fewer than 6,000 ever saw their homeland again. The numbers hit the chamber like physical blows. The scale of the German defeat was staggering by any measure. "And the Soviet defenders?" asked the Zalarian delegate, its crystal form pulsing with somber light. "They had paid a terrible price," Morrison admitted. "Over 1 million Soviet soldiers, and civilians died defending Stalingrad. The city was completely destroyed. It would take years to rebuild." "But they won," Zefkar said, his voice filled with something approaching awe. "They did more than win," Morrison replied firmly. "They proved that humans possess something that cannot be measured by weapons or technology. When we fight for something we believe in, when we defend what we love, we become unstoppable." Parker deactivated the holographic display, leaving the chamber in normal lighting. Morrison looked around at the alien faces staring down at him, seeing expressions he had never seen before on non-human features. "Stalingrad was not unique in human history," Morrison continued. "It was one example among thousands. At Thermopylae, 300 Spartan warriors held off an army of hundreds of thousands. At the Alamo, 200 defenders fought to the death against $5,000 attackers. At Rorke's Drift, 150 British soldiers defeated 4,000 Zulu warriors." Commander Parker stepped forward. "Again and again throughout our history, when faced with impossible odds, humans have chosen to stand and fight. We do not always win, but we never stop trying." The silence in the chamber was profound. Delegates were processing not just the story of Stalingrad, but the implications of what it meant about humanity as a species. Finally, Zefkar rose from his seat. The massive reptilian's posture had changed completely. The mockery was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like respect. "Captain Morrison," he said formally, "I withdraw my objection to humanity's membership in the Galactic Council." Gasps and exclamations filled the chamber. This was unprecedented. Zefkar had never changed his position on any issue. Any species capable of such determination, Zefkar continued, his voice carrying clearly over the noise, would be valuable allies rather than burdens. The Vorthak Empire formally supports human membership. One by one, other delegates began to voice their agreement. The Zalarian representative chimed approval. The Silicon Consortium voted in favor. Even the Methane Collective agreed to support humanity's application. As the formal vote was taken, Morrison allowed himself a small smile. Humanity had earned its place among the stars not through superior technology or military might, but through the simple demonstration that humans do not break under pressure. They endure, they adapt, they fight, and sometimes that is enough to change the galaxy.